What happened to Shaman King's art style? Shaman King is a niche classic, but one thing that everyone can agree on is that the art style is gorgeous. But it's gone through a lot of changes. The manga started around the same time as One Piece before it eventually ended after 32 volumes in 2004. But years later, series creator Hiroyuki Takei would add 3 more volumes. So in this video, I'd like to discuss the original charm of Shaman King's art style, analyze the changes that took place, and explain why it still holds a special place in the modern manga industry. Before I start, I do have a few disclaimers. First of all, I'm focusing solely on the manga, so this discussion will not go over the choices made in the 2001 anime or the 2022 anime. Second, as I just finished reading the omnibus volumes, I'm not going to look too closely at later spin-offs like Shaman King Flowers. Finally, as this will cover the entire story, this video will probably contain some spoilers. With those out of the way, let's start with what I consider the first stage of Shaman King's art style. Stage 1, or just early Shaman King, starts with chapter 1 and ends right around chapter 64. Some people might not like this stage as much as the later ones, but for a lot of reasons, this is kind of my favorite. This might be a bit of a hot take, but I think Shaman King is the epitome of early 2000s manga. Aesthetically speaking, that is. And I know it technically started in '98, but obviously it's the same ballpark. It's still the turn of the century. Part of this is because of how cartoony it looks. One thing I noticed right away is how similar it looks to One Piece, and there's a few reasons for this. First of all, they're coming out at basically the same time, also in the same magazine. Secondly, something I had no idea about, Takei and Oda were both assistants to Watsuki on Rurouni Kenshin. As a result, they had a lot of the same experience. And then later on, when they were both serialized in Jump, the two of them would often hang out together and talk about their manga. Kind of a cool fun fact, but also really helpful to keep in mind considering the two manga look so similar. One of the similarities they share is, again, how cartoony they look. So in early Shaman King, you have a lot of clearly defined line work, so outlines of characters will be very thick. This is reinforced by the lack of shading in this stage, so it's mostly lots of black and white with some grays here and there, meaning the thick outlines stand out even more. This is also true for the scenery and backgrounds, because at this time, they're just as cartoonish as the characters. Speaking of which, let's take a look at the characters and talk about how they start out in this stage. Actually, before I do that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So let's take a look at Yo in chapter 1. Obviously very different from his later iterations. But what exactly makes him so different? Well, first off, he's a lot pudgier. Not like chubby, but like everything is sort of rounded out. The face is round, his fingers are stubby looking, even his spiky hair has kind of a pudgy look to it. Another thing that makes the characters look the way they do is how Takei emphasizes certain features. Again, another similarity Shaman King shares with One Piece is how characters are drawn almost like caricatures. So a lot of times characters will have really big eyes and really big foreheads. Or you'll have a character like Amida Maru whose head is probably normal sized, but looks small compared to his big, long hair. Or you'll have a character like Ren, whose hair is so spiky that the whole top of his head is literally just one big spike. It's especially this way in early Shaman King, but it's something that's always part of the art style. So with Yo, for example, he always has these bangs that stand out. But when you look at his bangs in the early chapters, they look much more cartoonish. And this cartoonish look is achieved by the caricature-esque style in combination with the lack of shading. It's when Takei eventually adds more shading and more detail that the series would gain a more modern look. But we'll talk about that in just a second. One last thing we need to talk about are the spirits. The way Takei designed spirits in early Shaman King is very different than in later Shaman King. So for example, this is Horohoro's spirit ally, Kororo. She looks like she could be in one of the early Pokemon games because she's basically just a sprite with 2 eyes, a very basic haircut, and her cute little outfit. And this is true for a lot of the spirits. I mean, you have a badass character like Silva, and even his allies look goofy as hell. Even Ren's ally looks much more, I guess, cartoonish than the allies we would see in later stages. On that note, let's move on to the next stage. Stage 2, which I've dubbed the Shaman Fight stage, starts with chapter 65 and ends right around chapter 209. In other words, right around the time we get the Lucas and Marco fight. Okay, so right away, you're probably like, wow, that's a lot of chapters. And you're right. Like a lot of other great mangaka, Takei kinda already knew what he was going for when he started out. As the story goes on, he kinda just makes subtle changes. In some ways this is great, and in other ways it's not so great. So for example, one thing I didn't mention about early Shaman King is the amount of blank backgrounds. In the early chapters, you have a lot of panels where you have the character, then a background that's just solid black or white. In this second stage, there's a lot less of that, so you get more scenery. Ironically, this is where the backgrounds become less stylized. So instead of the cartoonish look you see in the characters, Takei draws backgrounds as is. This might be a hot take, but I actually don't like this change. I like how in series like Black Clover, the background adds to the style. But when we get this change, the backgrounds in Shaman King get kinda boring. Not all the time, as when Takei does bigger panels, they can look really good. But as you'll notice later on, backgrounds are never really a strong element in the art of Shaman King. One way this does work out, though, is with the characters. So while toning down the backgrounds makes them less interesting, it makes Takei's character designs much better. So let's use Yo as an example again. Let's compare Yo in Chapter 1 to Yo in Chapter 68. Clearly an improvement, as now, instead of these pudgy bundles of hair, he has actual bangs. And of course you'll notice that his face shape is a bit sharper, and the line work is much thinner. He still retains like 90% of his design, but you know, it's less in your face. Another thing I like about this stage is the paneling. Paneling in early Shaman King was never really bad, but it was never anything crazy. After chapter 65, you get paneling that's more diverse instead of just the usual squares and rectangles and boring angles, and it really helps elevate the action scenes. Even the action scenes themselves seem to get a slight improvement, and I think it's because Takei puts a little more thought into perspective and positioning. So for example, you have this panel from chapter 70. Not like you wouldn't see anything like this in early Shaman King, but it's just more common now. And while I'm not crazy about the backgrounds, I actually like how the simple background in this page allows us to focus on the characters. It just looks really good. And then you get to a panel like this one in chapter 72, and my God, does it look good. A rare double page spread, and it looks gorgeous. You have Ren and Yo in the foreground, the onomatopoeia in the middle to emphasize the action, and the other characters in the background showing what just happened. Again, doesn't show any drastic changes, but it just serves as an example of how Takei tunes up the art as the story goes on. That is, for the most part. I talked about this before, but I hate what he does with spirits later on. So we talked about how before they look all like Pokemon. Well, you look at the ones that got introduced in this stage, and they all just look like mechs. It's not bad, I just don't like it. One, because why do spirits just look like giant robots? And two, whereas spirits in early Shaman King have tons of personality, the ones we get later on they just all look the same. Speaking of which, let's move on to the next stage. The third stage, which you can call just the ending, starts with chapter 210 and goes right up until the original ending, which, if I'm correct, is chapter 286 in the omnibus volumes. Again, Shaman King got some new content after it originally ended, so the chapter numbers got skewed. But I believe the original ending was the chapter Manta had that weird dream about Princess Hao. Anyway, much like the previous stage, this one really just tunes up what worked before. So for example, line work gets even thinner. And as a matter of fact, the character shapes seem sharper now. For example, compare Matamune in his introduction in that flashback to his iteration in the fight in Hell. You can see that they look a lot different, and it's because of these changes in the line work and the shapes of the characters. Weirdly enough, Takei improves on the backgrounds and details. So there's more details in both character designs and backgrounds. So unlike the boring backgrounds we saw in the previous stage, they actually seem more realistic in this stage. And there's more shading for the art, so while Takei retains his art style, it achieves a more modern look because of the added attention to detail. Even the random characters in the background look much more realistic because of these changes. And that's all I really have to say for this stage. Again, it's not drastically different from the previous stage, but you can clearly see where Takei made improvements, so it's something you can distinguish from the earlier stages. And he would do this again in the final volumes in the later spin-offs, which brings us to the final stage. This stage, which I just called the later volumes, starts with the last 3 volumes, so volumes 33 and onward, and continues in the spin-offs like Shaman King Flowers. Again, it's very similar to the style seen in the previous stage, but Takei continues the changes he made before, so line work is even thinner and the characters' shapes are even pointier. I think this is the stage most casual or non-fans of the series recognize because it's the perfect blend of what people liked about Shaman King in the old days and the aesthetics of ongoing manga. So for example, Jujutsu Kaisen always stood out early on because of how the characters look polygonal. I wouldn't go that far in describing characters in the later volumes, but you can see how the characters look much sharper than in early Shaman King. At the same time, Takei retains his iconic art style by balancing out the sharp angles with plenty of curves and round shapes. On that note, now I'd like to give my final thoughts on the art style as I close out the video. First of all, I think part of why the art style stands out even today is because of Takei's incredible skills when it comes to character designs. While his skills in scenery and action aren't really anything crazy, I think he makes up for it in the way he makes characters so beautiful to look at, especially after he would improve his skills as time went on. I think the reason it still looks so good today is because it blends the old and the new. So for example, you look at modern One Piece and it's definitely unique, but only because it's still pretty cartoonish. Obviously, this is because of Oda's love for the older stuff and his goal to make sure One Piece reflects those older manga. On the other hand, Takei's art is also reminiscent of older manga, but he also borrows from the modern stuff. Obviously, he was drawing the later volumes in the 2010s, but even today you could release those chapters and a lot of people would think it's a brand new manga. I think what makes Shaman King's art look so good is that Takei takes what worked before and added the stuff that people like now. He toned things down and added more detail. It's a shame because of how the story would turn out, but I think we can all agree that his art only got better and better. And that's why people love the art in Shaman King. It's so 2000s. It's old school and modern at the same time. And it gave us some of the best looking characters in all of manga. But what do you think? How would you rate Shaman King's art style? How would you compare early Shaman King to the later chapters? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Soul Eater. In that video, I discuss Soul Eater's artistic evolution. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.